Welcome back to our coverage of Part 2 of the Alvendia corruption scandal. During Part 1 of the series, which was delivered by Johnny Rosario this past July, we explained the federal investigation into the decade-long corruption scandal at Guam Customs that exposed Henry Alvendia as the supposed ringleader of co-conspirators. Last night, we opened Part 2 of this special series by bringing you detailed facts of the allegations of crime against Raymond Martinez and Juanita Moser, the couple from Tamuning who were set up by Mr. Alvendia in an entrapment scheme carried out in Southern California. And we brought you the shocking revelation made in a sidebar disclosure to Judge Francis Tidinko Gatewood that the U.S. Attorney was originally after Mr. Alvendia's boss and personal friend, Ralph Scambaluri, the former head of the Guam Customs and Quarantine Agency. Tonight, we bring you details of how Mr. Alvendia managed to deceive every person around him in this case, how he used his wide network of former colleagues in law enforcement and childhood friends to dupe even highly trained federal agents into his plan, and why, by the end of the trial, this convicted federal felon was able to build enough leverage overall to attain his goals. What goals? They are mutually tied, each unable to be attained without the other. Mr. Alvendia's first goal was to steer the investigation from moving any higher and implicating Mr. Scambaluri. The second goal is as important as the first, to stay out of jail by convincing the federal government that the major drug ring they were truly after, the one told to us as a corruption case involving contraband cigarettes from the Philippines, didn't involve Mr. Scambaluri. He told them the sources were Mr. Martinez and Ms. Moser. By the time anyone figures out the ruse, it is too late. The government itself had done some underhanded things to bring what they thought would be a major bust into the drug trade. And not only does this community have to deal with the wanting for justice we never will see in the case of the United States versus Alvendia, because the most corrupt cop ever convicted here will never spend a day in jail. And not only will we have spent all this time kidding ourselves that the takedown of an innocent couple would cripple the drug trade in the 3 years since their arrest that coincides with the rise of the drug supply. If those two insults to the peace and stability of our people are not enough, we must face one more fact. The star witness of this trial is the person who fooled his way out of the debt he should be paying in our society. A public official who the prosecution called a liar and a thief will take the witness stand this month in the same courtroom where he never had to stand trial himself. Because of the secrecy of the proceedings, it has been hard to piece together the true story of what exactly went down and how the Alvendia corruption scandal and the Martinez-Moser trial even intersect. But after 3 years and one trial that ended with a hung jury, and thanks to Pacer, the Kandit News Group is able to piece this all together and to provide you a full account of what really happened and how Raymond Martinez and Juanita Moser are the victims of a huge ploy by Mr. Alvendia and federal officials to cover up several moving parts. For the federal government, you will soon learn in this second part of our 3-part series into the Alvendia corruption scandal, a monumental effort has been taken to cover up the incompetence of the U.S. Attorney's Office on Guam and how the mistakes they and federal investigators made not only will result in the most corrupt enforcement official in Guam history getting away with their crimes. It led prosecutors and law enforcement officials in Guam and from California to cover up the ploy to entrap Mr. Martinez and Ms. Moser, the perjury of officers as they testified under oath, allegations made strongly by the defense in open court, and unconstitutional activities used to bring the case to trial. These events were set into motion the day before the indictment, when Mr. Alvendia, through his vast network of highly placed friends, began to secure his freedom from the corruption charges through his plea bargain. Despite the U.S. Attorney's Office's admission to their original plan to take down Mr. Alvendia in order to get Mr. Scambaluri, there were federal investigators who had a different agenda. According to Mr. Alvendia's testimony on April 28, 2015, the day before the indictment, Mr. Alvendia's close friend since his childhood and former co-worker with both Guam and U.S. Customs, Special Agent Erwin Farron with HSI, brought his friend Mr. Alvendia into his office and showed him video footage of the federal government investigation that would prove Mr. Alvendia's corruption. Mr. Alvendia told Mr. Farron he would cooperate with further investigation. No one in the federal government had heard of Raymond Martinez and Juanita Moser by that time for any drug activity or so much as a violation of traffic laws on the road. That's because, as Mr. Alvendia reveals in the Martinez-Moser trial in his direct examination by Mr. Black, Mr. Alvendia was the person who first raised their names, telling federal investigators a story about the couple's previous conversations with him. He claimed that 2 years prior to that time, Mr. Martinez and Ms. Moser talked to him about the possibility of smuggling drugs into Guam. There is no recording and no write-down of any such conversation that took place. On cross-examination by Mr. Perez, attorney for Mr. Martinez, Mr. Alvendia admits to the jury that there is no corroborating witness to these conversations, nor are there any video footage or so much as a written report of the allegations he made. Yet, based on the testimony of this man who did in fact have a record spanning nearly 2 decades of misconduct, corruption, and dishonesty, sometime between April 28, 2015 and May 2, 2015, a 5-day intercession, the federal government suddenly shifted its strategy from using Mr. Alvendia to prosecute Mr. Scambuluri in the ongoing corruption scheme at Guam Customs and possibly cracking open the drug trade on Guam, to following an obscure tip about a couple never before heard of in police circles for criminal conduct. Yet that's what happened. On May 1, 2015, Mr. Alvendia reestablished contact with the Martinez-Moser couple following 2 years without communication. He and federal agents devised a scheme for him to ask the couple for help fixing his scooter. The federal agents wire him with a recording device, turn the device on, and he leaves to meet the couple at the former Scooter World in Agana. According to his testimony, Mr. Alvendia tells Special Agent Farron that he just needed the opportunity to speak with them and he knew that they would bring up the subject of drugs. But it's unclear how that subject came about in their first meeting in 2 years because by default or design, he moves their meeting to the coffee shop next door. And you can hardly hear what is said in the recording the entire time they are there. Knowing and understanding the truth of what was said and who brought up what in that first conversation is crucial. 5 more taped meetings and conversations are recorded, each one after the other, providing more detail, anxiety, and urgency to planning the purchase of an unnamed product in California and then bringing that product back to Guam. Over the course of these video recordings, Mr. Martinez and Ms. Moser asked Mr. Alvendia many questions, but it remains unclear what their perspective or purpose is. Are they asking questions to verify the soundness of the plan that Mr. Alvendia has masterminded? Or are they asking Mr. Alvendia for his assurances that the plan he has designed is one that is safe for them? In other words, was it even their idea? And if not, were they clueless about what to do and uneasy about going through with this scheme? Knowing who first brought up the idea would help the jury a great deal to determine whether the defendants are fluent criminals, fully capable of committing the crimes they're accused of, or whether Mr. Alvendia picked 2 friends out of a Rolodex to scapegoat in exchange for his freedom. 2 people who, without the inducement by the federal government and its corrupt ambassador, were not drug smugglers and who do not have the criminal mind to ever attempt so in the future. 5 more recorded conversations occurred, all of which were recorded at the instruction of federal case agents by Mr. Alvendia and without Mr. Martinez and Ms. Moser's knowledge. Throughout these conversations, the trio pieced together a plan that had already been preconceived by Mr. Alvendia and federal case agents. It is important to note that the couple had already purchased tickets to California a month prior to their conversations with Mr. Alvendia to make arrangements for their wedding and attend a graduation. They also planned to stay with Mr. Martinez's mother in Los Angeles for a few days before heading back to Guam in early June. Mr. Alvendia proposes to the couple the plan that he and the agents devised, which was to smuggle in an unknown product and bring the product to Guam using Mr. Alvendia's Guam Customs credentials. The plan included concealing the product in pails of buckets of rock salts, meant for a jacuzzi water softener that Mr. Alvendia was supposedly building. The government told the jury then, as they will tell the jury in October, that in those pails were 8 pounds of methamphetamine. The prosecution's entire conspiracy case is built around tapes which detail this planned event, a plan that federal agents testified about under oath, admitting that it was their idea. The execution of this plan is how it came to be that sitting on the floors of the rental van, 2 Torrance police officers allegedly found 2 buckets labeled Morton. We will come back to the controversy that surrounds the contents of those buckets, but first, it's important to know that this scratches only the surface of reasonable doubt for the jury. A lot more happened between that first meeting and the traffic stop in Torrance. For instance, the evidence points to a very telling fact. Mr. Alvendia and not Mr. Martinez or Ms. Moser attempted 27 other phone calls to the couple, all to no avail. The prosecutors are trying to convince the jury that this couple masterminded a plan to smuggle millions of dollars in street value of methamphetamine to the island, yet the evidence points to a couple that hardly seems interested in answering Mr. Alvendia's phone calls. Finally, just 2 weeks after Mr. Alvendia's indictment, the couple began their trip to the U.S. mainland. On May 26, 2015, they land at Los Angeles International Airport. They proceed to Enterprise Car Rental, and from there they leave with the van they rented without any surveillance of their whereabouts until the evening of June 1. By that time, Mr. Martinez had informed Mr. Alvendia by phone that he will be leaving Las Vegas and returning to LA that night. Mr. Martinez allegedly told Mr. Alvendia that, quote, everything was good to go, unquote, and Mr. Martinez agreed to meet Mr. Alvendia at a Home Depot located at the Torrance Crossroads Shopping Center on June 4. Before getting into those final 3 days, we're going to fill the gaps in this fact-rich story left by the absence of evidence other than the unrecorded word of a corrupt man. The big elephant we may have been staring at while discussing the so-called product the couple allegedly purchased was methamphetamine. And the elephant's pink twin sister is this. If the government believed that the so-called product was methamphetamine, who was the source and why is there no record of an attempt to find the source? Re-enter Special Agent Matt Hernandez, the federal officer we mentioned in the beginning of tonight's special feature. When asked by defense counsel why, if federal authorities truly set up this scheme in order to learn who the source of the alleged drugs was, he installed a GPS tracker onto the couple's van after they allegedly purchased the product and not before. When the tracker could have led directly to the source, he casually replied that he tried to do just that. According to Mr. Hernandez, he went to LAX the day Mr. Martinez and Ms. Moser arrived to install the GPS tracker on the van they were to be issued, but somehow this civilian couple was able to beat him to Enterprise Car Rental, and he was unable to install it. Neither he nor any other agent working the case put a tail on the couple. No surveillance was conducted, and this is on top of the fact that although the federal government went through great lengths to record conversations between Mr. Alvendia and the couple, they did not perform a wiretap on their phones in order to learn the identity of their so-called source of drugs. Officer Ricci even made it a point to stress during the trial that their purpose always is to move up the chain of criminality and go straight to the source. This was a point repeated by the prosecutor, Fred Black, during a sidebar with Judge Gatewood and the defense attorneys. Mr. Black even admitted that the purpose of their investigation into Mr. Martinez and Ms. Moser was to get to their supposed supplier. Yet no effort was made to find this supplier, when the federal government was aware of and had every opportunity to follow their movements from the moment they landed at Los Angeles International Airport. It was almost as though there really was no interest at all at finding the source, as was the stated objective. Or the agents knew from the beginning that the entrapment of this couple was the endgame. It wasn't to find the source of the drugs at all. The entrapment scheme, which the federal government vehemently denies, and for which each of their witnesses testified against using identical terms, was revealed from the testimony of one agent to the next during cross-examination in the trial. The plan for the June 4 takedown begins with Mr. Alvin Diaz giving the couple the location where they were to meet and allegedly hand the product over to him. On June 1, Agent Hernandez places the GPS tracker on the couple's van rental. He claims to have not used the tracker to pinpoint the couple's whereabouts on June 4. However, the digital fingerprints the tracker leaves behind tells a different story. On the morning of June 3, federal agents meet to discuss the June 4 operation, even though the federal government maintains that it was not planned and that the couple merely was pulled over for a traffic violation. On that same day, Officer Hernandez, the federal agent with HSI, contacted Torrance Police Department Detective Anthony Chavez to enlist him and 6 other Torrance police officers to provide 24-hour surveillance of the couple. The two became friends since their days in training class for the Los Angeles Police Department. Aside from monitoring the GPS coordinates of the couple, Detective Chavez does 2 significant things that day. He applies for a warrant to place and monitor the GPS tracker that was installed on the van 2 days prior, and he places a call to his friend at the Redondo Beach Police Department, Officer Daniel Ricci, who is a trained dog-sniffing canine handler. His canine partner on the force is a German Shepherd named Blitz. Detective Chavez asked Canine Officer Ricci to be in the vicinity of Pacific Coast Highway and Madison Street, which is near the border between the cities of Torrance and Redondo Beach in LA County. He tells Canine Officer Ricci that his drug-sniffing dog Blitz will be needed because there will be a narcotics traffic stop on Madison Street on June 4. He tells the drug-sniffing dog Officer Ricci to stand by for a call from the neighboring Torrance Police Department. The following day, the day the entrapment scheme is carried out, Mr. Alvin Diaz speaks by phone to Mr. Martinez and Ms. Moser and redirects them from the Torrance Crossroads Shopping Center to Best Buy and tells them which route to take to ensure the traffic stop would take place. At around 11:10 a.m. Pacific Standard Time, Torrance Police Department Officer Ryan Schmitz pulls the couple over on PCH and Madison Street, testifying to the court that he had bumper paced the van at 52 miles per hour in a 45-mile-per-hour zone. After pulling the couple over, Officer Schmitz places a call to Canine Officer Ricci, who is with another police department, requesting for canine narcotics search despite having no probable cause to do so. Officer Schmitz was caught in a lie on the witness stand when he was asked how he knew to call Canine Officer Ricci. Under cross-examination by defense counsel Peter Perez, Officer Schmitz, attempting to steer clear of confirming evidence that the federal government had pre-planned to entrap the couple, instead confirmed that he neither received a call from either federal agent Hernandez or his colleague in the Torrance Police Department, Detective Chavez. And here is the conversation from Mr. Perez. You didn't have a conversation with Detective Chavez that morning, am I correct? Officer Schmitz, that's correct. And you did not have a conversation with Agent Matt Hernandez before you pulled over these folks, right? He says, that's correct. And you have no discussion with Officer Ricci before that day, am I correct? He responds, that's correct. And since you didn't speak to Chavez or Hernandez, neither of them told you about Officer Ricci, is that correct? He says, that's correct. So tell me, how is it that you knew to call Officer Ricci? Officer Schmitz went into a senseless explanation about calls placed through the Redondo Beach Police Department dispatch. He backtracked his earlier statement that he called specifically for Canine Officer Ricci and instead said that he called for a canine officer. Mr. Perez then asked why. If he was performing a traffic stop and had no probable cause to suspect drugs, would he call for a canine unit? His answer was incoherent. Clearly, the officer was lying, and the stop was staged to fit the entrapment. After all, no sooner had Officer Schmitz supposedly placed this call, which is nowhere in the record, than did Canine Officer Ricci show up to the scene, supposedly from the next city over. Canine Officer Ricci and his partner Blitz walk over to the van, which had its front windows down. Blitz is a highly trained drug-sniffing dog who uses specific signals to indicate the presence of specific drugs. In this case, Blitz alerted to the presence of methamphetamine. But he doesn't alert to where you might think. The dog sniffs along the van, then jumps and places his head into the open window of the front passenger side and sniffs around. He then gets down and begins sniffing and increasing the intensity of his search. Blitz finally hovers on the ground near the driver's side rear passenger tire and begins his alert. He scratches furiously at the rear wheel well of the tire, and a small black device falls from the van to the pavement. It's the GPS tracker that Agent Hernandez had placed on the van 3 nights prior. However it came to be that Blitz's alert to narcotic odor focused on that GPS tracker remains a mystery. But one thing is known. This highly trained drug-sniffing dog did not alert inside the van where officers claim they found the 2 buckets on the floor of the van. He alerted to the GPS tracker only. One should wonder if the couple really did have drugs in the van. Why is it that the canine Blitz did not alert inside that van where the drugs allegedly were? Why did the canine Blitz only alert to the GPS tracker? It remains a mystery whether methamphetamine was contained in the tracker or if the tracker was doused in it, because federal officials refused to surrender the tracker to lab testing and even told the judge, as late as last week, that they destroyed the tracker. As a matter of fact, the GPS tracker almost never made it into the memories of evidence in the case, because none of the officers on the scene ever reported its existence, and the fact that the drug-sniffing dog alerted only to that tracker and nothing else. This fact was confirmed by an expert in canine drug detection, Kyle Hyan. Mr. Hyan is a veteran of the LAPD and its SWAT team who is internationally renowned for his expertise built over 3 decades in canine drug detection. During questioning by Mr. Perez at the trial, Mr. Hyan read a portion of his report regarding Blitz's find, and this is part of it. Based on the sworn testimony of Officer Ricci, it is my opinion that during the sniff of the Toyota Sienna van, that Blitz did, on his own, give an objectively observable trained final response and remained at that location after he alerted and pinpointed to the source of that odor. But that wasn't what Officer Ricci wrote in his report. He never mentioned the GPS tracker at all. As a matter of fact, no one did. Testimony after testimony and report after report, none of the officers at the scene or involved in the investigation so much as mentioned the GPS tracker. They all concealed its existence from the defense. Under cross-examination by Mr. Perez, Canine Officer Ricci admitted to picking up, holding, and examining the GPS tracker after Blitz furiously scratched at it and dislodged it from the van's undercarriage. Canine Officer Ricci, this is what he says. I'm not sure what the exact course of events was, but I did have the occasion to hold it, look at it. Yes, sir. Mr. Perez responds, and you did not mention it in your report, right? And he says, yeah, it didn't seem like an important fact to me. That's what Matt Hernandez says, to which Mr. Perez replies, okay, now something your dog alerted to didn't seem like an important fact, am I correct? Only under intense scrutiny on the witness stand did each of these officers testify to the existence of the GPS tracker, telling the court and the jury that they did not think the tracker to be material to the case, that all the officers said they didn't exist until Blitz got onto the scene and sniffed that tracker. Why go through such lengths to conceal the existence of the tracker? There are 2 very plausible reasons, and both of them could be accurate. The first is that the officials working the case had doused the tracker with methamphetamine, knowing that there would be a drug-sniffing dog at the scene and underestimating its training to precision. If this reason is true, then it may also mean that officials either knew there would not be or were unsure whether methamphetamine were being transported by this couple. The second reason officials didn't want the GPS tracker revealed is because it was installed and monitored illegally. If you recall earlier in this story, Agent Hernandez placed the GPS tracker on the van the evening of June 1, but the warrant needed to place the tracker on the van and then to monitor it wasn't issued until June 3. Detective Chavez, who sought the warrant in the Superior Court of California and not in any district court or by the approval of a federal magistrate, also was the person leading the surveillance team and monitoring the GPS tracker's movements. Detective Chavez said on the witness stand that he did not monitor the tracking during the days preceding the warrant. The Kandit News Group will delve more into those issues and other issues of constitutional law bizarrely handled by the court during pretrial motions in the third installment of the special report on the Alvendia corruption scandal. But even Detective Chavez's testimony doesn't jibe with the reality of the use of that GPS tracker. Enter Teddy Estrelado, GPS expert witness called by the defense to prove that someone with access to the GPS tracker really was monitoring the device, and not just on the day of the traffic stop, but ever since the tracker was planted the evening of June 1. So Mr. Estrelado says in his report, "My analysis of the data reported back that the GPS was being utilized and monitored from June 1st all the way to June 4th, and that the data itself was being configured and changed throughout that time." Mr. Estrelado also testified that he was able to determine the speed of the van based on the GPS data. He testified that the estimated speed of the van was 31 miles per hour and that it was mathematically impossible that the vehicle ever exceeded 45 miles per hour. Perhaps the most ironic revelation was the use of the tracker itself to prove another alleged lie told by Officer Smits on the stand, that the couple was traveling past the speed limit on PCH, the original reason given for the traffic stop. After all is said and done about the entrapment scheme, and in spite of the perjurious testimonies of the law enforcement officers before a federal court, there remains the 2 buckets of rock salts allegedly on the floor of the van behind the driver and passenger seats. Aside from the fact that the drug-sniffing dog Blitz did not alert to these buckets and whatever was inside these buckets, no one in the Redondo Beach Police Department, the Torrance Police Department, or Homeland Security investigations can account for the custody of those buckets once the couple was told to exit the van and after Blitz had ignored the buckets. And that's because in the testimony given by Officer Smits and the report filed by his Torrance PD partner, the two could not agree with each other and with themselves about these buckets. Officer Smits disagreed with himself, first telling the court that he removed both buckets, then only one. He also contradicted himself about whether he left the buckets sealed or he poured the contents of one of the buckets out on the pavement near the van. In fact, from the time the Martinez and Moser couple were instructed to exit the van until the buckets arrived in the custody of Homeland Security investigations, there is no clear chain of custody. No one knows for sure what happened to those buckets, though the federal government will have the jury believe that 2 buckets now in their custody are the buckets in question. From the arresting officers to the help from the Redondo Beach to the arrival of federal agents, the chain of custody is missing. Same with the GPS tracker. Kandit learned late Wednesday, October 3, that the federal government had destroyed the GPS tracker. This, very much like the buckets allegedly containing 8 pounds of methamphetamine hydrochloride, was sought by the defense the past 3 years for independent laboratory testing. All requests were denied, and only days ago were the defendants and the court apprised of the tracker's destruction. Laboratory testing to confirm that the tracker had been doused with the methamphetamine would possibly have brought closure to this case, solidifying that the conspiracy to conduct illegal activity wasn't the brainchild of the Guam couple, but the federal government itself. Now the test of culpability is for the jury to decide, but not before Judge Francis Tidinko Gatewood, after hearing arguments from both sides, ruled against a defense motion to prohibit Officer Smits from taking the stand following the perjury the government will never charge him for, stemming from the first trial. Not before every law enforcement officer involved in the Torrance traffic stop and the events leading up to it failed to place in any of their reports that a GPS tracker was found on the van. Not before the dog handler of the canine, Blitz, who dislodged the GPS tracker and made his final drug detection alert on the tracker itself, concealed from his superiors, investigators, and even Assistant U.S. Attorney Clyde Lemons, the original prosecutor on the case who retired from service in the middle of the trial, the existence of the tracker. Not before the entire government witness team plotted and induced the defendants into an entrapment scheme that meticulously hid such a plan and inducement from the jury and the court. Not before officers of the law lied on the stand under oath. Not before these officers violated the constitutional rights of the defendants. Not before the government breaks its chain of custody over the 2 buckets they accuse the defendants of smuggling drugs in. In fact, every single government witness, including Mr. Alvin Diaz himself, testified under oath that they never saw Mr. Martinez or Miss Moser with drugs or with those buckets. Not before the very cause of their traffic stop, speeding, is manufactured by a police officer who perjured himself on the stand. Not before authorities lied, not just about the existence of the tracker, but its use without a properly issued warrant. Not before that tracker was destroyed by the same federal government that claimed it had lost the device years ago. Not before one jury, having debated this matter with the limited facts presented to them, could not reach a verdict. Before the trial that is about to start, these defendants have spent the past 3 years of their lives facing the behemoth of the government, its tyranny, and every ruthless move we thought existed only in Hollywood settings of the prosecutor's game. Every day of these 3 years has grown more important for the couple, not simply because it was another day for them and their attorneys to fight how they must for justice and for their freedom, but because a guilty verdict in this trial that's about to start will mean they will face over 20 years in prison for a crime that it seems the federal government was all too eager to get them to commit. A crime where it isn't just the evidence that seems grossly corrupted, but those whom we normally would trust to preserve the integrity of that evidence and the investigation of crime. It is an uphill battle, one where finding the defendants not guilty means much more than the failure of the prosecution to prove guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. In this case, the weight of the testimony anchoring the court to precedents of blind trust in the integrity of officers of the law, the burden of proof has and continues to be on the defendants. What they seem certain to prove is that the reason it all doesn't make sense isn't because they are guilty of the conspiracy, but because those coming for them, the mixture of federal and state officers, conspired to corrupt this case. Mr. Martinez and Ms. Moser's liberty, future, and children be damned. Their legal team may be able to start that argument with the government's own witnesses and the other California and federal agents involved in the case. Testimony after testimony, none of them saw the couple with any drugs or so much as had surveillance yield the couple uttering the name of a drug once. That includes all of Henry Alvin Diaz's taped conversations with them. First, HSI agent Matt Hernandez in his cross-examination by Mr. Perez. Mr. Perez says, ask him, in your investigation in the case, you never saw either Mr. Martinez or Ms. Moser meet a supplier. Mr. Hernandez says, correct. Mr. Perez, you never saw them receive any contraband. Mr. Hernandez says, correct. You testified, quote, based on the conversation I had, we suspected that the defendants might have narcotics. But again, it was unsure because we never saw any transaction take place, unquote. So Mr. Perez, the court asked you, quote, you never saw the defendants hand over anything into the vehicle or outside the vehicle. Is that what you're saying? Unquote. And then you said, correct, right? And Mr. Hernandez says, yes. Then there is HSI Special Agent Urfel Matanguian, one of the 2 lead agents on this case, who was examined by Mr. Perez. It was the defense, not the government, who called Agent Matanguian to the stand. Mr. Perez asked him, you never saw them in possession of any drugs, is that correct? Mr. Matanguian says, that's correct. Mr. Perez then asks, and you never tested any drug exhibit, correct? And Mr. Matanguian responds, yeah, I've never tested any drug exhibit. In fact, by all accounts, no one at the scene of the alleged drug seizure had any of their body cams on. There was no recording of what would be the heart of the conspiracy. No fingerprints were taken, no DNA evidence was gathered and tested. The only thing the government has is a series of taped recordings featuring conversations among Henry Alvendia, Raymond Martinez, and Juanita Moser, and not once did the name of a drug come up. In a rash of sidebar conversations among the lawyers and the judge, the defense team several times expresses the totality of the problem with the so-called evidence. Judge Gatewood, are you trying to point out that somebody is going to testify that in their assessment the drugs were planted? Mr. Perez responds, I'm saying you can't believe the government's case that the defendants were in possession, that these drugs were discovered the way that the government claims. It's not credible. Then in a blistering series of acknowledgments that has to leave the jury wondering what in the world is happening, Canine Officer Ricci admits to Mr. Perez that there is no way of verifying any of his testimony or whether what he says was in that van was actually there. Mr. Perez asks, when you searched the van, you didn't find any gloves. When you claimed you found buckets, you said those were 3-gallon buckets, right? And you never reported any seals on the outside of the buckets or the bucket or buckets, correct? You searched one and somebody else searched another, correct? You never took any photographs of anything that you did on that day, is that correct? You didn't photograph any evidence. You didn't photograph the scene, correct? You didn't call the crime lab. You didn't obtain any fingerprint evidence, correct? You didn't obtain any DNA evidence. And because there was no dash cam, we don't have dash cam video, correct? He answered affirmatively to all of those questions, one by one. In a sidebar during K-9 Officer Ricci's examination, Judge Gatewood tries to get a better understanding of where the alleged buckets of drugs were located in the van so she can visualize where the K-9 blitz alerted to the drugs versus the position of the GPS tracker and the buckets. The prosecutor, Mr. Black, says it is clear that the dog sniffing of the crack of the driver rear sliding door shows the dog alerted to the buckets inside the car. Mr. Perez says, then why didn't Blitz alert when he went into the windows? Why didn't he alert to the scene where the location of the driver's seat is? Why did he only alert to the location of the GPS? And the reason is because that's where he detected narcotic odor and nowhere else. About the distance from where he detected it versus where they say the drugs were placed doesn't make sense. And Judge Gatewood says, you're right. This was the only place that he did alert. The prosecutor doesn't disagree with the contradiction between K-9 Officer Ricci's testimony and the professionally trained alert of his K-9 partner, who was not taught how to deceive. He instead tries to convince the court that Mr. Perez's line of questioning shouldn't be allowed because he believes Mr. Perez is trying to raise the constitutional question of whether the GPS tracker should have been poisonous fruit that would cause the suppression of evidence. Mr. Black says none of this is relevant because it goes to the issue of the suppression. But Judge Gatewood responds, no, no, no. That's not the issue now. They're questioning the credibility of the witness. In another part of the trial, Mr. Lujan tells the court, our clients are being framed. Indeed. This has been episode 2 of part 2 of the Kandit News Group's inaugural special entitled The Alvendia Corruption Scandal. We will bring you episode 3 tomorrow night of part 2, and following that, our finale in part 3 of the Alvendia Corruption Scandal. This has been a pleasure to bring this to you tonight on behalf of Johnny Rosario and the Kandit News Group. Buenas noches and buenas noches.